I want to start first off by pointing you to this fine tree here. It's called a Dawn Redwood. The Dawn Redwood is referred to as a deciduous conifer. So we think of trees as being deciduous, and we think of trees being conifers, like our native Douglas firs or western red cedars. So this tree does in fact produce cones like a conifer tree would, but it also loses its leaves every fall. So it turns a lovely kind of bronzy orange color in the fall, sometimes to gold, and then those needles drop and fall off, and then it's in the process right now of putting out brand new leaves. They're just starting to emerge right here. And so for those that don't understand the nature and the life cycle of this tree, they might see a tree that looks like a conifer for most of the year, and all of a sudden the tree drops its needles and it looks like it's dying. But that's not the case, obviously. So it drops its needles every year, it puts out a new flush every spring. So it's kind of the best of both worlds in a lot of ways. Interesting thing about the Dawn Redwood too, it's referred to as a living fossil. So this tree appears over and over and over again in the fossil record, and it was largely thought to be extinct until the 1900s. I think it was around the 1940s the tree was rediscovered and brought forth, and it's planted widely as an ornamental. This tree grows really well in western Washington, but it also will be very successful if you live in eastern Washington. So it's a really unique tree, just a real interesting story behind it. And this tree in particular was dedicated to Washington's first woman governor on June 3rd, 1980. Her name was Dixie Lee Ray. And so if you're thinking about how to celebrate Arbor Day from home, under these circumstances, feel free to Google the Dawn Redwood and learn about its history and its place in the fossil record. Feel free to Google Dixie Lee Ray and find out what her accomplishments were for the state of Washington. There's a lot more things that we're going to talk about on this tree tour today, and so feel free to bring up any of those. National Association of State Foresters might be another one that you want to look up with your kids at home, just to learn about who that organization is and what they do. So thanks for listening to our story about the Dawn Redwood, and now it's time to move to our next tree. So as I mentioned, our 100 Trees project was putting 100 new trees in the ground on the Washington State Capitol campus. This is one such tree. This is an eastern redbud. Actually, it may be a western redbud. I'd have to go check. They're very similar though. The western redbud is it's considered an understory tree. Understory trees are those that grow in the shade of larger trees that occupy the overstory or the dominant canopy species. So redbud trees, like a lot of other understory trees, including dogwoods and Japanese maples and the vine maple, our native vine maple is an understory tree. They tend to spread out more than they spread up, or more than they grow upwards, but nonetheless, redbud is a really, really cool tree in the springtime. We haven't seen this one flower just quite yet, but the flowers actually come out before the leaves, and they come out directly attached to the stems. So a lot of times we'll see flowers that come out and they're attached to a little stalk. The little stalk will come out, or a twig will come out, and the flowers will be sort of hanging off of that. The neat thing about the redbud tree is that the blooms will be directly attached to the wood, and it's just kind of highlights the tree's architecture in these kind of deep, rich pink or purple blooms, depending on the cultivar that gets planted. So one of the things to point out about this particular tree is that we see that it's staked here. But I want to point out that the stakes are pretty loose, right? The reason that we do that is because we want this tree to move a little bit. When the tree sways and moves in the wind, it responds to that wind stress by growing wood where it needs to support itself. And so if we stake this tree really tightly so it can't move, then the tree doesn't respond to the wind stress, and therefore it doesn't add wood where it needs to strengthen itself. And so we end up with a stronger tree altogether, and a tree that's much more wind firm, that when we make sure that it's staked very lightly. So think about stakes on a tree as an emergency feature. Like if there was a huge gust of wind, or it would keep the tree standing upright, or it also creates sometimes a physical barrier so that people feel like they can't get too close to the tree, or someone can't accidentally bump into it and knock it over. But yeah, Redbud tree, really neat. Look it up. Great specimen, great small tree for your yard or your garden. We're gonna wrap around here and look at one of my favorite trees on the Capitol campus. I'm going to stop right here first just to talk about this tree from a distance, because this tree is so big that we can appreciate it from many different angles. We can appreciate it from a distance, we can appreciate it up close, but I really wanted to give you a sense of how massive this tree is. This particular tree is an English oak, so it is not a native species, but it's closely related to our native Gary oak. Both the Gary oak and the English oak are in the white oak family, meaning they have rounded lobes on their leaves rather than pointed lobes. That's the big difference between the red oaks and the white oaks, is the red oaks are pointy leaves and the white oaks are rounded leaves. But the English oak, this tree actually predates the Capitol campus. Where the new Helen Summers building is right there, historically it used to be the location of a school here in Olympia, and one of the folklore is that one of the teachers at the school came out and planted a tree with the children on Arbor Day well before the Capitol campus here was developed. So this tree is, we don't know exactly how old it is, but we think it was planted sometime in the early 1900s. So what's special about this English oak tree is that it is the national champion English oak tree. So a tree designated as the national champion means that it's the largest tree of its species anywhere in the United States. So Washington State is fortunate here to have the largest English oak in the country. You're looking at it right here. It's right here in plain sight on the Capitol campus. And one thing about champion trees in Washington State is that thanks to our highly productive soils and abundant rainfall, Washington is home to many, many champion trees. So that's another way that you can celebrate Arbor Day at home this year, is just by breaking out your computer and doing a little Google search for champion trees. So the champion trees is there's a registry of champion trees. It's a searchable database that's on the website of American Forest. They're a nonprofit organization that promotes forestry around the country, and so one of the things they do is to manage and highlight the champion tree program. So just a really, really neat tree. One of the things that there's a saying about oak trees, that they grow for 300 years, they rest for 300 years, and they expire gracefully for 300 years. And so in this tree's hopefully 900-year lifespan or longer, recognize that we are just 120, 130, maybe 140 years into it. So this tree has a long way to go. And just about anywhere else you go in the United States, if you saw a tree of this size and stature, this tree is approximately 122, 124 feet tall, roughly. To see a tree of this size and stature anywhere else in the country, you might expect it to be in really poor health or maybe starting to decline and fall apart. But the great news is that this tree is exceptionally healthy, so we expect it to be here for a really, really long time. I also wanted to point out that this is, again, is part of the 100 Trees project. We have 2 other redbud trees that are planted right here as part of that project, and all of this used to be turf grass except for the area directly under the tree where the leaves are. And this is all going to be mulch now. When we all get back to normal and the crews can get back out here and put the mulch down. But mulch is one of the best things for your trees in the landscape. It helps reduce competition from weeds. It helps keep the soil temperature in check so it doesn't get too hot. And that's what roots like. It helps with nature's recycling process and promotes earthworms and other insects and bacteria and fungi to help break down those leaves and keep the soil really oxygenated and aerated. A lot of turf grass areas tend to be highly compacted because we're using them, we're walking across them. But here we have the designated pathway that hopefully that keeps people's foot traffic confined to here, and we'll have this nice mulched area for this tree. And I think that this tree will be even healthier. It will respond better. It will probably grow more vigorously as a result of having removed a lot of the turf grass and put a lot of mulch back in its place. So mulch, actually, another benefit of mulch is that it retains water. It's a really important one. It kind of acts like a sponge and it holds that water in the soil, or it holds that water and then releases it more slowly to the soil so that the roots can take it in. Yeah, so let's move on to our next tree. And I gotta say, what a spectacular Arbor Day. At the Department of Natural Resources, we often say it always rains on Arbor Day, because it usually rains on Arbor Day. So I'm really glad to be out here with you on a day that's not raining. Needless to say, it would be harder to do this if it was raining. If you recall, I mentioned the mulch that's about to be put down. Well, there it is. And then behind it is several of our flowering cherry trees here on the Capitol campus. I next want to direct your attention to this tree here. This is an American elm tree. So many of you may be familiar with a disease called Dutch elm disease that was imported from Europe. Unintentionally imported from Europe in the late 1800s, I think early 1900s perhaps. And Dutch elm disease really ravaged the populations of American elm in the United States. So Elm Street is one of the most common names for streets in the United States. And if you go to any street named Elm Street today, it's probably not lined with elm trees anymore because of Dutch elm disease having nearly wiped out the entire population of American elms. So we're fortunate here in Washington that Dutch elm disease took a much longer time to get here. And even after it arrived, we do have Dutch elm disease in Washington, but the disease doesn't spread as vigorously as it does in other parts of the country. So we do have trees that are infected with Dutch elm disease here. We see that disease spread relatively slowly in those trees in a way that can be managed so that affected branches can be pruned out. And therefore sort of protecting the tree from the disease spreading even further. But we know that this particular tree is showing no signs of Dutch elm disease. So it either doesn't have the disease or it has it and it's very good at fending it off, right? So that we don't see the signs and symptoms of it visibly to the naked eye. But the other neat part about this tree is that this is considered the George Washington elm tree. So I believe it was back in the 50s or 60s, there was a project to take seeds from an elm tree that historically, or at least the mythology goes, that George Washington convened the Union Army prior to the Civil War, or at the onset of the Civil War, beneath an elm tree. And so seedlings were taken, or I should say seeds were taken from that tree with that history behind it. They were grown out and they were distributed to all 50 states, and not just one tree but multiple trees. But as things go, good records were not always kept, so a lot of those trees are maybe still in the landscape but no one knows what their significance is. In other cases, the trees didn't survive for whatever reason. But we're fortunate here that we know that this is our George Washington elm tree. It's one of only a couple. I think there's only 2 other George Washington elms in the United States that are known to be from that project and from the seed source of that original tree. Again, this tree is very healthy, carries our historical significance, and of course we are Washington State, named after George Washington, and our Capitol campus was modeled after the National Capitol campus in Washington, D.C. So lots of layers of significance with this particular tree, and I'm really glad that we have it. I'm glad that it's so healthy. So let's move on. We got another really cool story to tell you about some new trees that were put in as part of that 100 Tree Challenge. So we have 3 new Douglas fir trees on the Capitol campus. This is one of them here. We have 2 others right beside me. These Douglas firs are not just any old Douglas firs. I should say Douglas fir is it is the most common tree in Western Washington, or probably the most common tree in all of Washington. But we have one. These are descendants of the moon tree. And the moon tree is a Douglas fir that's planted on the exact opposite corner of the Capitol campus. That tree was part of a project in 1970s. There was an astronaut who was also a botanist who wanted to take seedlings from trees and other plants up into space. And so he worked to collect seeds from every state, trees that are native to those states, and then loaded them onto one of the space missions. The seeds went up, they orbited the moon, and then they came back down, and they wanted to redistribute those seeds out to the states to see if there would be any difference in how those trees grow. Washington's Douglas fir tree, dubbed the moon tree, it has its own plaque over there. We don't see anything unique or different about how that tree has grown, so for all we know, its trip to space did not have an impact on its genetics. But nonetheless, it's a fun experiment, and it's a fun story to tell. And so what happened is that we wanted to make sure that we were preserving the story of that moon tree. So the moon tree is in very good health, but nonetheless, we wanted to make sure that we were continuing its legacy. So we worked with folks from DNR's Meridian Seed Orchard. They do a lot of work to grow trees that ultimately get planted back out on DNR parcels after timber harvest. But we worked with them. They took some cuttings off the branch tips of the moon tree and then grafted them onto other Douglas fir rootstocks. So similar how you might graft apple trees together to get a certain apple variety, we wanted to preserve the genetics of the moon tree, and that's what happens when you take a cutting. The cutting that you take becomes the top part of the new tree, and that's a genetic replica of the tree that it was taken from. We grafted onto rootstock from a different Douglas fir, and then that part stays below ground, but the rest of the tree will be genetically identical to the moon tree on top. So just like we have the moon tree on that corner of the Capitol campus, we now have 3 moon trees, or maybe they're half moon trees if you consider that the roots are of a different species than the tops, over here on the Capitol campus. So just another way to help promote trees on the Capitol campus and promote the history and all the interesting things that trees have to share with us. So that concludes our tree tour today. I'm so glad that you could join us remotely from your homes, wherever you are. I hope that you're all healthy, and I hope that you're all faring relatively well under these circumstances. I also want to point out that it was very convenient for Sarah and I to meet here at the Capitol campus because it's very close to where we both live. But you don't need to come this far. You don't need to leave your home to appreciate trees. There are trees in your neighborhood. If you're out walking the dog, if you're taking your kids for a walk around the neighborhood, if you're just even out in your yard, just enjoying the yard, enjoying the sunshine, doing a gardening project, it's a great opportunity to just kind of slow down, take a step back, and appreciate trees for everything they do for us, the many benefits they provide, and so on and so forth. So another way that you can celebrate Arbor today, besides Googling the moon tree or the national champion trees or Dixie Lee Ray, our first governor, is there's a lot of resources on the Washington State Department of Enterprise Services website. The Department of Enterprise Services is the state agency that manages the Capitol campus and the grounds here. They have a ton of resources online. They have a brochure that goes over all the trees that are planted on the campus, or at least many of the trees. And they have some other online resources as well about the 100 Trees Project, the planting plan for this particular location, so feel free to check that out. But as you're going out into your yards and gardens, here's a neat idea, because we're at this really exciting time for trees right now. The buds are starting to swell, and they're approaching this moment that we call bud break, where the buds burst open, right? And they don't explode, they burst open slowly, and little tiny leaves will start to emerge, right? So you can go outside with your kids today and just pick a tree and pick a branch and pick a single bud and just try to follow that bud every single day until its leaves are completely unfurled. And you'll notice that the bud will start to swell in size, and then it will gently pop open, and then there'll be these bright Kelly green little proto leaves, little baby leaves that'll come out, and they'll eventually sort of unfurl and expand and elongate and change color. And you can follow that for as long as we all have to do this, and that's just another way that you can keep yourself occupied and keep yourself interested in trees. So with that, I'll say happy Arbor Day. Thanks for joining us. Stay home, stay healthy. We're doing a great job as Washingtonians to flatten the curve, and let's keep up the great work. Thanks so much.